There's been a noticeable rise of concern among Christians in the past 15 years or so of justice issues in the world. Human trafficking, modern slavery, people without access to clean water, hunger and food insecurity, racial injustice. This focus on justice and all the injustices in the world is good because God is a God of justice. However, there's a spiritual injustice in the world today that I rarely ever hear being discussed. Before we address this spiritual injustice, I think would be helpful for us to define some terms just to make sure we're all on the same page and understanding each other. These terms are unsaved, unreached, and unengaged. There are other terms similar to these being used today, but they're not always clearly defined. So for today, we're just going to focus on these that have a common understanding and a common definition to them. Unsaved. Well, this one we have a grasp on, don't we? We all have a good sense of what this is. It's the people in the world who have not yet experienced forgiveness and justification through Jesus Christ, not in a right relationship with God. The unsaved are everywhere. Wherever we go, we're going to encounter unsaved. But of all the unsaved in the world, there's a subset of those unsaved called the unreached. Now, unreached are those unsaved people who don't have a reasonable access to the gospel. They're likely to go their entire life without ever seeing a Bible in their own language, without ever meeting another believer, another follower of Jesus, likely never to hear the true message of the gospel. Now, these are usually defined as unreached people groups, are usually defined as those people groups where there's less than 2% evangelical believers and less than 5% Christians living among them. With the idea that there's so few among them that people groups usually doesn't have a viable chance to hear. Now, among the unreached, there's another subset called the unengaged. And unengaged are unreached people groups that have no missionary serving among them. So there's no one who's made an effort to go and reach that people group. Now, that group, it changes all the time because as soon as a missionary goes to the unengaged, they're no longer unengaged, they just move to the broader unreached category. But then as soon as the only missionaries among a people group drop out from them, then they shift back. So that's a fluid category. So for today, we're going to stick just with the broader group of the unreached. How many unreached are there in the world today? Well, it's sad, I think we should all feel a sadness that 2,000 years after Jesus gave the Great Commission, still 42% of the world's population would be classified as unreached. Now, this large number of people, they live in a relatively narrow band of the world called the 1040 window, which goes from 10 degrees north to 40 degrees north latitude from Africa to Asia. That relatively narrow band of the world is where 96% of these unreached people groups live. Almost all of the unreached in the 1040 window are either Muslim, Hindu, or Buddhist. Now, another way to view the world is through what's called a cartogram. This cartogram that you're seeing is a map of the world that instead of showing it proportional to the geographical size of the country, it shows it according to the unreached people group population. Notice just how proportionally large the spiritual need is in North Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. Okay, now that we understand these terms and we understand where these unreached people groups are living, now it's time to address the spiritual injustice that exists in the world today. There are 5.5 million full-time vocational people in ministry in the world today. 5.5 full-time Christian vocational workers. 435,000 of them are cross-cultural missionaries. However, less than 3% of all the missionaries in the world serve among the unreached. Now you might be wondering, how can this be, Ed? Where are 97% of the missionaries working if they're not working where the greatest spiritual need exists? Well, I have another graphic to show you that answers that question. You'll see in this graphic that the bigger the circle, the larger the number of missionaries serving. And you'll see that the vast majority of missionaries in the world are going to the Americas, Europe, and sub-Saharan Africa. All areas outside of the 1040 window, all areas where 96% of the unreached don't live. Well, what are we to do with this information? What are we supposed to do about this spiritual injustice? Well, first, if you feel specifically called to serve in a country that's outside the 1040 window, obey God. That's always the right thing to do. It's always the best thing to do. So if you feel a specific calling to serve in a country outside of the 1040 window, all I ask of you is that in your ministry, whoever you're discipling, make sure they're aware of this spiritual reality in the world. In your discipling, be raising up people who are going to go and address this spiritual injustice. But for the rest of you in this room and the rest of you on Zoom, if you don't have a very clear, specific call from God to go serve in a country outside the 1040 window, I want to bring you a challenge today based off of a quote from Hudson Taylor. It will not do to say that you have no special call to go to the unreached. With these facts before you and the command of the Lord Jesus to go and preach the gospel to every creature, you need rather to ascertain whether you have a special call to stay at home. I plead with you. Just pray today. Lord, here am I. I'm young. I'm healthy. I'll go. Can I go? And see how God answers that prayer. Now, I've noticed whenever you address justice issues or injustice in the world, it can leave us feeling very overwhelmed. It can be very confronting. But actually, right now, I want you to feel that way. I want you to feel confronted by the billions of people who are living their life and have virtually no chance to hear the gospel. Let's bring that to God now in prayer.